Everyone remembers the Titanic. Its name has become synonymous with disaster, a floating palace swallowed by the icy darkness of the North Atlantic, carrying more than 1,500 souls into history. But there was another ship. A ship larger than the Titanic. A ship built to correct every mistake that doomed its famous sister. A ship reinforced with thicker steel, a double hull, improved watertight compartments, and enough lifeboats to carry everyone aboard. It was called Britannic. According to history, she should have been the safest passenger ship ever constructed. Yet less than 5 years after the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, Britannic also sank. Not in the freezing Atlantic, but beneath the calm blue waters of the Aegean Sea. She vanished in only 55 minutes. Even stranger, although Britannic represented everything engineers had learned from the Titanic disaster, something still managed to defeat every improvement. Officially, the explanation is straightforward. A German naval mine. A tragic wartime accident. But history often records only what can be proven. It rarely preserves the whispers exchanged between sailors, the uneasy remarks of shipbuilders, or the strange stories carried home by the survivors. Because among those who witnessed Britannic's final voyage, some believed they were not merely escaping a sinking ship. They believed they had sailed aboard a vessel that had never escaped the shadow of her own family. So tonight, we investigate the forgotten sister of the Titanic, a ship that many historians describe as one of the greatest engineering achievements of her age, and one that others quietly remember as the final chapter of a tragedy that may have begun long before her maiden voyage. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world's oceans had become a stage. Nations competed not with battleships alone, but with magnificent passenger liners that embodied wealth, innovation, and national pride. For the White Star Line, the answer to this rivalry was bold. Build 3 ships unlike anything the world had ever seen. Together they would become known as the Olympic-class liners. The first was Olympic. The second was the Titanic. Third, Britannic. They were not merely ships. They were floating cities. Each one stretched farther across the sea than nearly any vessel before it. Their grand staircases shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Their dining halls rivaled Europe's finest hotels. Every polished brass fitting and carved wooden panel declared a single message. Human ingenuity had conquered the ocean. Or so people believed. Construction workers in Belfast labored beneath towering steel frames that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Thousands of rivets echoed like gunfire. Massive cranes swung plates of steel into place. The air smelled of hot metal, coal smoke, and seawater. Many workers later recalled feeling both pride and unease. Building ships this enormous demanded tolerances never before attempted. One misplaced rivet, one flawed plate, one unnoticed weakness. Any could become catastrophe. Among shipyard workers, old traditions remain surprisingly strong. Some refused to whistle while working aboard unfinished ships, believing it invited storms. Others carried small charms tucked into their pockets. A few quietly crossed themselves whenever another section of hull disappeared behind scaffolding. Official records contain no evidence that the ships were considered cursed. Yet maritime folklore has always thrived where danger is constant. When men spend their lives between sky and sea, superstition often becomes another form of survival. In 1911, Olympic entered service. First, everything appeared successful, but within months she collided with the British warship HMS Hawke. Though Olympic survived, the accident shocked observers. How could one of the most advanced ships ever built suffer such a dramatic collision? Investigators blamed hydrodynamic forces created by two enormous vessels passing close together. To engineers, the explanation made sense. Sailors. It became the first unsettling story surrounding the White Star Giants. One ship damaged, two still waiting. Then came April 1912. The Titanic. She sailed amid extraordinary confidence. Newspapers praised her luxury. Passengers admired her scale. Many believed technology had finally mastered nature. The iceberg shattered that illusion. When Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic, the tragedy transformed more than maritime safety. Transformed public imagination. Suddenly, ships that had once represented hope began carrying something else. Expectation, fear, memory. Britannic was still under construction when news of Titanic's sinking reached Belfast. Everything stopped. Designers returned to their drafting tables. Government officials demanded answers. Engineers examined every blueprint. Every lesson learned from Titanic had to be incorporated before Britannic ever carried passengers. The changes were extensive. A double hull was added around vulnerable sections of the ship. Watertight bulkheads were extended higher. More lifeboats were ordered than ever before. Enormous gantry davits capable of launching boats from either side of the vessel towered above her decks like giant mechanical arms. On paper, Britannic became one of the safest ships in existence. Seemed impossible that history could repeat itself. Yet among some workers, an uncomfortable phrase began circulating quietly through the shipyard. "Steel remembers." No one knew who first said it. No newspaper ever printed it. There is no official document recording those words. But decades later, oral histories collected from maritime communities in Belfast recalled similar expressions. Reflections of shipyard superstition rather than evidence of any real curse. The idea was simple. Once tragedy touched a family of ships, the sea never entirely forgot. Most historians dismiss such stories as the natural result of grief. After a catastrophe like Titanic, people searched desperately for meaning. Patterns appeared where coincidence existed. Rumors filled gaps left by uncertainty. Yet coincidence has an uncanny way of unsettling even the most rational observer. Olympic had collided. Titanic had sunk. Now every eye turned toward Britannic. The youngest sister carried not only passengers' hopes, but also the burden of proving that mankind had finally learned from disaster. Then the world changed again. In 1914, Europe descended into war. Luxury suddenly seemed irrelevant. Instead of transporting wealthy travelers across the Atlantic, giant liners became valuable military assets. Britannic never fulfilled the role for which she had been built. Before she could begin a civilian career, she was requisitioned by the British government and transformed into a hospital ship. Her elegant interiors gave way to wards lined with white beds. Dining rooms became operating theaters. Grand salons filled with medical supplies instead of first-class passengers. The magnificent liner would now carry the wounded home from distant battlefields. Her gleaming black hull was repainted white. A broad green stripe stretched along her sides. Huge red crosses identified her as a protected medical vessel. From a distance, she appeared less like a luxury liner and more like a floating sanctuary. A place of healing. A beacon of hope amid one of history's bloodiest conflicts. Yet, some crew members later recalled that despite her new appearance, Britannic never felt entirely peaceful. Several remembered unusual conversations among experienced sailors before departures. Nothing dramatic. No ghost stories. Just quiet remarks. "Let's hope she breaks the family's luck. The sea already knows her name." Again, such recollections emerged years after the events and cannot be verified. Whether these comments were truly spoken or shaped by memory after the sinking remains impossible to determine. But they reflect a truth about life at sea. When danger is constant, superstition often sails alongside experience. On her hospital voyages through the Mediterranean, Britannic performed exactly as intended. She transported thousands of wounded soldiers. Doctors praised her facilities. Nurses admired her stability. Crew members gradually began trusting the great ship. Perhaps the fears had been exaggerated after all. Perhaps Britannic truly had escaped the shadow of Titanic. On a calm November morning in the Aegean Sea, the silence beneath the water was broken by an explosion so violent that it echoed through every deck. Within seconds, the safest ship ever built began fighting for her life. And as engineers rushed to contain the flooding, they discovered that something no blueprint had anticipated was already working against them. The morning of November 21, 1916, began like dozens before it. The waters surrounding the Greek island of Kea shimmered beneath a pale autumn sun. Gentle swells rolled across the Aegean, reflecting streaks of gold as if the sea itself had chosen peace over war. On the bridge of the Britannic, officers surveyed a horizon that seemed almost unnaturally calm. There were no enemy ships in sight, no smoke on the horizon, no warning that, beneath the tranquil surface, death had already been waiting. Official records indicate that the Britannic was carrying more than 1,000 people, including medical staff, crew, and military personnel. Unlike the Titanic, she was not packed with wealthy passengers or families beginning new lives across the Atlantic. Instead, she carried doctors, nurses, orderlies, sailors, men and women whose purpose was not luxury, but mercy. The ship had become a floating hospital. Its once grand dining halls now echoed with a clatter of medical carts instead of crystal glasses. The elegant first-class lounges had been transformed into wards lined with white beds. The scent of polished mahogany had been replaced by antiseptic, clean linen, and medicine. It was a ship built to save lives. Ironically, many aboard believed that made her one of the safest places in the Mediterranean. Among those serving aboard was Violet Jessup, a stewardess whose name had already become part of maritime history. She had survived the collision involving the Olympic. She had survived the sinking of the Titanic. Now she found herself serving aboard the Britannic. Some sailors joked that she possessed extraordinary luck. Others quietly wondered whether fate simply wasn't finished with her yet. Years later, Jessup would describe that morning as peaceful, almost ordinary. Breakfast was being prepared. Medical staff attended to patients. Crew members cleaned the decks. Engines pulsed steadily beneath thousands of tons of steel. No one sensed that the voyage had only minutes left. At approximately 8:12 a.m., the illusion shattered. A violent explosion erupted along the starboard side of the ship. The blast reverberated through steel corridors like the roar of an underground earthquake. Passengers stumbled. Glass shattered. Steam pipes screamed. Electric lights flickered. Far below the waterline, seawater rushed through torn compartments with terrifying force. Official investigations concluded that the Britannic most likely struck a German naval mine laid by the submarine U-73 several weeks earlier. The evidence strongly supports this explanation. Yet some crew members later recalled something unsettling. Several described the explosion as strangely muted, not like the sharp detonation they expected. One sailor reportedly remarked that it felt as though something enormous had struck the hull from beneath. Such recollections remain anecdotal and cannot be independently verified. Memory, particularly after trauma, is rarely perfect. Even so, those words would become part of the ship's enduring legend. Captain Charles Bartlett reacted immediately. His orders rang through the ship. Close the watertight doors. It was the very system redesigned after the Titanic disaster. If any vessel could survive catastrophic flooding, this one should. Massive steel doors thundered shut deep inside the ship, or at least, most of them did. Within minutes, engineers began sending alarming reports to the bridge. Water continued advancing. Compartment after compartment disappeared beneath the sea. The captain quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Britannic was sinking, and she was sinking far faster than anyone believed possible. The irony was almost unbearable. Everything engineers had changed after Titanic had been intended to prevent precisely this moment. The ship possessed 17 watertight compartments, a strengthened hull, improved pumping systems, more lifeboats than necessary. On paper, Britannic should have remained afloat even with several flooded compartments. Yet reality ignored the calculations. Investigators later discovered one crucial factor. Many of the ship's lower portholes had been opened to ventilate hospital wards. The Mediterranean climate was warm. Fresh air was essential for recovering patients. As the vessel developed a starboard list, those open portholes slipped below the waterline. The sea no longer needed to force its way inside. It poured through openings willingly left exposed. Room after room flooded almost instantly. The very feature designed to comfort wounded soldiers became an unexpected pathway for disaster. Some historians argue that this single decision doomed the Britannic. Others believe the explosion caused far greater structural damage than originally estimated. Engineers continue debating the precise sequence of failures more than a century later. Yet for those aboard, the cause mattered little. Only survival did. As nurses hurried patients toward the boat deck, calm began giving way to fear. Footsteps echoed through endless corridors. Metal groaned under increasing strain. Some wounded soldiers, unable to walk, were carried on stretchers toward the upper decks. Others insisted on helping despite their injuries. One doctor later recalled seeing crew members reassuring frightened patients, even as seawater climbed steadily through the lower levels. There was panic, but there was also extraordinary courage. Outside, the sea remained deceptively beautiful. Sunlight danced across gentle waves. White foam sparkled around the ship. Nature offered no hint that one of the largest vessels ever constructed was dying. This contrast haunted many survivors. One nurse later remembered thinking that the sea looked too peaceful to be killing us. As lifeboats were uncovered, Captain Bartlett faced an impossible decision. Should he immediately abandon ship, or attempt to beach the Britannic on nearby Kia Island? He chose the latter. The engines remained running. If the ship could reach shallow water, hundreds of lives might be saved. It was a logical decision. It almost worked, but it created a deadly danger that few on deck fully understood. Meanwhile, whispers spread among portions of the crew. Not official reports, not commands, only quiet exchanges spoken under mounting fear. The sea has her. It's happening again. She's following Titanic. Such remarks were never entered into naval records, and historians cannot verify that these exact words were spoken. Yet similar expressions appear in later survivor recollections and maritime folklore, illustrating how fear often gives rise to stories that blend memory with superstition. As Britannic surged forward under power, her list increased. The bow sank lower. Water thundered through corridors that only minutes earlier had been filled with doctors and nurses. Furniture broke free. Doors slammed open under immense pressure. The ship seemed to breathe, a deep metallic groan reverberating from one end to the other. To many survivors, it sounded almost alive. Modern engineers explain these sounds as the natural stresses of a massive steel structure twisting under uneven flooding. Yet aboard the sinking liner, few had the luxury of engineering explanations. They heard only the cries of a dying giant. Then came the first fatal mistake. Fearing the ship would sink before reaching shore, several crew members launched lifeboats without authorization while the engines were still turning. At first, the boats appeared to drift safely away. People sighed with relief. They believed they had escaped. Seconds later, the sea itself seemed to change. The lifeboats began sliding sideways, slowly, then faster. No amount of rowing could stop them. Ahead of them, towering above the water, Britannic's enormous propellers were beginning to emerge from the sea. And they were still spinning at full power. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying moments in maritime history. The gigantic bronze blades, each taller than a house, transformed into unstoppable rotating walls of steel. The lifeboats were drawn directly toward them. The screams that followed echoed across the calm waters of the Aegean. Some survivors later said they had never witnessed anything so sudden or so merciless. One boat was lifted almost vertically before vanishing beneath the churning blades. Another shattered into splintered wood. People who had survived the explosion now faced a nightmare no evacuation drill had ever imagined. The sea was no longer merely swallowing the ship. It had become a trap. And in the terrifying minutes that followed, survivors would encounter a force many described simply as the pull, a powerful suction that seemed determined to drag everything into the depths with the dying Britannic. For those still aboard the Britannic, time had become meaningless. Only 50 minutes had passed since the explosion. Yet the ship already looked as though it had endured hours of destruction. The starboard list grew steeper with every passing moment. Decks that had once been level now tilted sharply toward the sea. Medical equipment slid across polished floors. Stretchers toppled. Chairs crashed into bulkheads. Glass shattered underfoot. The great hospital ship was becoming a mountain of steel sinking beneath its own weight. Above the noise, Captain Charles Bartlett finally gave the order every sailor dreaded. Stop the engines. The command came too late for those lifeboats already caught in the water. The propellers, each nearly 5 meters across, continued spinning for precious seconds as momentum slowly faded. By then, the damage had already been done. Official reports confirm that 2 lifeboats launched without orders drifted into the turning propellers, resulting in one of the deadliest moments of the sinking. Dozens of lives were lost in an instant. It remains one of the most horrific evacuation accidents ever recorded at sea. Among the survivors was Violet Jessup. For the second time in her life, she found herself escaping a doomed White Star liner. Years later, she recalled being forced to jump into the sea. The powerful current beneath the sinking ship pulled her downward with terrifying force. She later wrote that she struck her head against the ship's keel as she was dragged beneath the surface before managing to break free. Doctors would eventually discover that the blow had fractured her skull. Somehow, she survived. It is one of the most remarkable survival stories in maritime history. Other survivors described the sea as behaving in ways they had never experienced. Some spoke of an overwhelming suction that seemed to pull everything toward the ship. Modern naval engineers explain this phenomenon clearly. As a vessel of Britannic's immense size filled with water and descended, it displaced enormous volumes of seawater, creating powerful currents capable of drawing nearby debris and small boats inward. No supernatural force was required. Physics alone was deadly enough. Yet for those caught in that current, scientific explanations came years later. In the moment, many believed the sea itself had come alive. One crewman later remembered looking back from a rescue boat. The Britannic no longer resembled a ship. She looked like an enormous white cliff sinking into the earth. The bow disappeared first, then the bridge, then the towering funnels tilted toward the sky. For a brief moment, the stern rose high above the sea, exposing the massive bronze propellers that had only moments earlier become instruments of unimaginable tragedy. Silence. At 9:07 a.m., just 55 minutes after the explosion, the largest passenger ship ever lost at sea vanished beneath the waters of the Aegean. The ocean closed over her almost gently. There was no towering wave, no violent whirlpool swallowing everything nearby. Only expanding circles across the surface, and an eerie stillness. The Britannic was gone. Of the more than 1,000 people aboard, only 30 lost their lives. A tragedy, but far fewer than the Titanic. The improved evacuation procedures, warmer waters, and the proximity of nearby islands helped save hundreds. From a humanitarian perspective, the Britannic represented an important lesson learned from the Titanic. Yet emotionally, the sinking carried a different weight. The safest ship White Star had ever built had still failed. Not because engineers ignored the past, but because war, circumstance, and a chain of small decisions overcame even the best preparations. And for many sailors, that was enough to keep the old whispers alive. Perhaps the Olympic-class ships had never escaped their shadow. More than a century has passed since the Britannic disappeared. The war ended. The White Star Line faded into history. Generations came and went. But beneath nearly 400 feet of clear Aegean water, the forgotten sister still rests. Unlike the Titanic, whose wreck lies crushed beneath crushing pressures in the North Atlantic, the Britannic sits in relatively warm, oxygen-rich water. She remains astonishingly well preserved. Modern expeditions using remotely operated vehicles and high-definition imaging have revealed a vessel that appears almost frozen in time. Her bow rests firmly against the seabed. Windows still frame empty corridors. Railings remain recognizable. Massive anchors lie where they fell. The ship looks less like a ruin, and more like a city abandoned overnight. Marine archaeologists describe the wreck as one of the finest preserved examples of early 20th century shipbuilding anywhere in the world. Yet divers often speak about something impossible to photograph: the atmosphere. Several experienced technical divers have described an overwhelming sense of silence surrounding the wreck. Not ordinary underwater quiet, but an emotional stillness. Some compare it to entering an abandoned cathedral. Others say the ship seems strangely untouched by time. Such experiences are deeply personal and subjective. There is no scientific evidence that the Britannic possesses paranormal qualities. The stories continue. Among fishermen on nearby Greek islands, older generations have long passed down tales about the waters surrounding Kea. Some legends tell of ancient sea spirits protecting the islands from arrogance. Others speak of places where the sea remembers. These stories existed long before the Britannic, long before the Titanic. To local folklore, the sea was never merely water. It was a living force that demanded respect. Historians view these tales as part of the rich cultural traditions of the Aegean, rather than evidence connected to the sinking itself. Yet after the Britannic disappeared, Many locals quietly folded the disaster into those older legends. The great foreign ship had entered waters already wrapped in myth. Its fate became another chapter in stories that had been told for centuries. Modern technology has also produced mysteries that, while explainable, continue to fuel speculation. Deep-sea recordings sometimes capture groaning, clicking, and resonant metallic sounds around large wrecks. Marine engineers attribute these noises to thermal expansion, shifting sediments, marine life, and the gradual deterioration of steel under immense pressure. But when those sounds echo through the darkness around the Britannic, it is easy to understand why some divers describe them differently. One expedition member reportedly remarked, "It sounded like someone knocking from inside the hull." There is no evidence that anyone was. Only a ship continuing its slow conversation with the sea. Then there are the photographs. Sunbeams filtering through broken windows. Long corridors disappearing into darkness. Operating rooms now inhabited by fish. Rust-covered wheelhouses standing in eternal silence. To some observers, they are extraordinary archaeological images. To others, they look like the final frames of a ghost story. Perhaps that is why the Britannic continues to fascinate. She occupies an unusual place between history and imagination. Not haunted because evidence proves it. Haunting because the human mind cannot resist filling silence with questions. Today, almost everyone knows the Titanic. Films, museums. The disaster became one of the defining tragedies of the 20th century. The Britannic almost disappeared from public memory. Ironically, she was larger, safer, more advanced. She embodied everything engineers learned after the Titanic. Yet history often remembers the first great tragedy, not the quieter one that followed. For the White Star Line, the sinking marked something deeper than the loss of another vessel. It marked the fading of an era. The dream of building ever larger floating palaces had collided first with nature, and then with war. The Olympic would continue serving for years before eventually being retired. Titanic lay beneath the Atlantic. Britannic rested beneath the Aegean. The three sisters had begun as symbols of limitless ambition. Only one would outlive them all. Was there ever an Olympic-class curse? History offers no evidence of one. The accidents that befell the three ships each have well-supported explanations rooted in navigation, engineering, wartime hazards, and human decision-making. Yet history is only one way people understand tragedy. Sailors have always carried another. One built from memory, from coincidence, from stories exchanged during long nights at sea. They know that oceans inspire respect because they never offer guarantees. When disasters happen again and again, even rational minds begin searching for patterns. Not because curses are real, but because grief often asks questions that facts alone cannot answer. Perhaps that is why the Britannic still feels different. She was not a symbol of reckless confidence like the Titanic. She represented redemption, second chance, proof that humanity could learn from catastrophe. And yet, despite every improvement, despite every lesson, despite every precaution, she still slipped beneath the waves. Not with the chaos that immortalized the Titanic, but with a quiet finality that history almost forgot. Somewhere beneath the blue waters of the Aegean Sea, sunlight still reaches parts of her wreck. Fish weave through empty wards where nurses once hurried to save lives. Seagrass grows across decks that once echoed with footsteps. The engines are silent. The corridors are empty. The clocks have long since stopped. Only the sea continues its endless vigil. Whether you see the Britannic as a remarkable engineering story, a wartime tragedy, or a ship forever surrounded by folklore, one truth remains. She reminds us that the ocean has never belonged to humanity. We merely pass across its surface, and sometimes keeps what it is given. The Titanic became history's greatest legend. But beneath the quiet waters of the Aegean lies her forgotten sister, larger, stronger, and built to survive the very fate that claimed the Titanic. History tells us that the Britannic struck a German naval mine, and the evidence strongly supports that conclusion. Yet along the shores of Kea, among divers who descend into her silent corridors, and in the stories passed between generations of sailors, another question has never entirely disappeared. Was the Britannic simply another casualty of war? Or did the sea claim the last of the White Star giants in a way that history can never fully explain? Perhaps the answer rests where she still does, in the silence below. If you enjoy real-life mysteries, forgotten history, and terrifying documentary stories, subscribe, leave a comment with your own theory, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into history's darkest secrets.